So this is a presentation of the zoning bylaw update project, which has been approximately 3 years in running. The current bylaw was passed back in 2002, and we, the Board of Selectmen, town manager, myself, we had put together, the selectmen appointed the committee to look at the bylaw, and we brought some consultants on board to assist us. So after this 3-year project, tonight's really the beginning of a public output session, public outreach session that we're conducting, and we'll be presenting the how we got here and why and where we'll be going from here, and then it's directed towards the planning board and the selectmen, so if they have questions, there's microphones on their table, and I'll be announcing later on in the presentation of the follow-up meetings that we'll be having through the end of this month. So I had just gone over why we're here, what we're trying to accomplish. So the committee itself, you see there that the current composition is Robert Fowler, who's with the planning board representative, Ed Johnson, the building commissioner, Richard Cuco, Aaron Wortman, who is a planner in another community, but a resident of Tewksbury, and then Mark Kratman is the selectman representative. In the past, Todd Johnson represented the Board of Selectmen, Nancy Reed was planning board representative, and Lenny Dunn was a citizen representative who also served on the Zoning Board of Appeals. The consultants, Judy Barrett, who is to my immediate right, and then Bob Mitchell, who's to the far right. They're the primary team of consultants that worked on the project. And then Robert Ritchie, who is a former assistant attorney general who worked in the municipal law unit for a number of years, reviewing towns' bylaws, and I think he was town council in Springfield. Amherst, thank you. So he's on the team and gave us a lot of support when it came to looking at the sign bylaw. And then David Gamble is an architect who is focused on urban design and worked on the design guidelines. Staff included myself, Anna McGinty, who's town planner and is in the audience, and then Dawn Cathcart to my left, who is our recording secretary. She works in the building department as a permit technician and provided us a lot of valuable input. So the committee has, again, been in formation since 2016, has met over 32 times over the course of those 3 years, and there's been 4 drafts that have been put out by the committee that have been on the website. They held 2 public input sessions during that time period. There was 1 public presentation that was made to the planning board, which was David Gamble, who talked about design standards. And there's one outstanding issue which kind of creeped into our conversations when we were having the committee conversations, and that was to look at upzoning to address pre-existing non-conforming residential lots. And we've taken 2 looks at this right now where staff has gone in and done some analysis. And when we started talking more about how this should be conducted, we started looking at it and saying that it really should have a greater in-depth analysis, and we're breaking that off from consideration under this project. Again, this project is really looking at recodifying the text of the bylaw, and it's looking at updating the bylaw and removing inconsistencies. So the upzoning issue is really something that can and should be done aside from what we're trying to achieve in this project. This is kind of a long slide. I know those are boring, but it's just to give people a little bit of context of Tewksbury's zoning history. You could see that in 1956, we shifted to the 1 acre zoning, which has kind of created this problem of the pre-existing non-conforming parcels. Also, back when the zoning map was done, parcels along the railroad and interstate were zoned heavy industrial, and I think that the thought was that that was where the town wanted to locate commerce. The maps themselves back then were not at a parcel level, so it was basically, 300 feet off of the B&M railroad line was a heavy industrial district. So it gave no consideration to cutting through lots or what ended up becoming residential neighborhoods over time. Through the 1980s, there was a site plan special permit that was introduced into the zoning bylaw, which kind of created a dual permitting process. Back in the early 80s, the Zoning Board of Appeals had a lot of special permit authority. With the site plan special permit introduction, there became a dual permitting process where you had the planning board looking at site plan special permits and the ZBA looking at use special permits. We still have site plan special permits in the zoning bylaw today, and the Zoning Board of Appeals special permits have been diminished over time. You see there in the 90s, there were some zoning changes, and then the current bylaw that we're operating off of was developed back in 2000, 2001. Mark Grabowski is a land use attorney. Most planners and land use attorneys are very familiar with Attorney Grabowski. He's written a handbook, taught at one of the law schools, and he's actually represented us on a lot of comprehensive permits. But he was hired to update the zoning, and the zoning update that occurred was more at the staff level back at that time. This just predates me a little bit, but the document was delivered to the planning board finished, and the planning board was asked to take it to town meeting. And so the planning board spent a little bit over a year working on that document, and then ultimately it did go to town meeting and was approved. And then from that approval in 2002 up until 2015, the planning board operated with the zoning bylaw subcommittee. There were a lot of meetings that were held, and you could see that there was approximately 126 amendments over the course of those 13 years. Not all of those were planning board articles. There were some citizen petitions that had come in. And then in 2015 brings us up to where we are today in this process. So with that history, and then with the 2016 master plan update, there was a call for a zoning review. And it was because of some of the issues that were found in the current zoning bylaw. And so the attempt was to get in and reorganize and reformat the bylaw, update and clarify some of the use regulations, eliminate legal conflicts and internal inconsistencies and conflicts that were there. And again, this is just, as things evolve over time, you may have something in one section of the bylaw that is referencing something that is inconsistent with something that's somewhere else in the bylaw. There was a interest in clarifying and simplifying the administrative and permitting process, and then an update to the zoning map as necessary. So, zoning's not boring, it's serious business, and it can get awfully technical and in the weeds with the details. And I'm gonna run through this. Zoning diagnostic, which was the first thing that the consultants did, which was, again, using their experience, was to take a look at how our current zoning bylaw operated. And this is where they found that some of the items were dated and disorganized, and there were numbering errors in the bylaw. There was information that was difficult to find, and then some of the district regulations needed better integration over time, integration because of how they evolved over time. So the definitions, you can see here that they weren't always consistent. They were in different sections of the bylaw. You couldn't go to one section, the definition section, and find all of the definitions. There were definitions that were in some overlay districts. There were definitions that were in the affordable housing section of the bylaw. So that was a concern. And then some definitions were unclear. Here's just one example. I think that word "such" shows up 6 or 7 times in one sentence that really wasn't necessary to have that type of extraneous language in there. Additionally, it was found that some districts had purpose statements while others did not. And again, that was based on this evolution over time as things were being put into the bylaw. Some did have those purpose statements. The heavy industrial terminology is archaic and could be possibly a misleading term. We had districts such as the Highway Corridor Overlay District, which was back in 2004 for the Mills Mall, which has not happened, and anything to occur over there now would probably be significantly different than what's in the bylaw. There's the multifamily District 55, which is, it's kind of a complicated and rarely used section of the bylaw, and what we brought forward is something that kind of integrates that and didn't make it necessary. And then the Community Development District, which there's only one development or one district, and that's the Emerald Court project. And so that district was written specifically for that development back in the late 90s and was permitted in the early 2000s. Most of what the uses that are there could operate under a typical multifamily development. And then the Section 9340, it's a development impact statement, which has never been utilized and is really covered by a number of other places of review, whether it be traffic review or environmental type reviews. So there was an interest. I think it's no surprise that we have a significant number of overlay districts. We do have a dependency on special permits. There's an interest in introducing administrative site plan review, design guidelines, some training for the town boards, and then dimensional standards. And some of the zones just did not align well with established development patterns. So what was found was that the overlay districts were put in place during an economic downturn encouraging development. That did happen, and there was a lot of development along Route 38. Over time, going back to the 2002 zoning recodification that was done, prior to that, every zoning district was listed as an appendix to the zoning bylaw, and it had it was parcel specific. So it became very lengthy, and as parcels were changed over time, the questions became, does the zone still apply to this one, the newly created parcel out of an old parcel? It's no longer referenced in the bylaw, so does it apply? So we were able to, the Planning Board Zoning Bylaw Subcommittee spent almost a year, I think, updating the zoning map, which we ended up taking every one of those descriptions and putting it onto a map, and then taking that map and bringing it to town meeting So now we do have a true zoning map depiction of all of the zoning districts. Also, over the course of, since 2002, open space residential design was introduced, which allows for environmental protections and subdivisions, and for some cost savings as far as building out a road, and then the town's long-term maintenance of these shorter roads that are in OSRDs. The inclusionary zoning was introduced over the last 10 years, maybe, well, over the last 15 years. And the inclusionary zoning is where there is a requirement that 15% multifamily developments provide affordable housing. And when the open space residential design came into effect, there was the requirement that 10% of the units would provide for affordable housing. I have listed here that it's yielding affordable housing. I think, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, but the fee in lieu of providing the affordable units on site has assisted the town in saving 77 units at one project on our subsidized housing inventory, and has also been responsible for, I think, the creation of right now 34 to 36 units of affordable housing. We were faced, the next bullet here is creating the West Side Neighborhood Business District. This is over on the Woburn Street area. I think everyone knows that that area of town has some heavy industrial uses. It has a very tight neighborhood with small lots there. So the planning board's zoning bylaw subcommittee came up with this West Side Neighborhood Business District to try and address those conflicts. The Office Research District was also created during the last 15 years, which was taking a look at properties north of 495 that were zoned heavy industrial and trying to upgrade that zoning to something that was more in line with what had come out of the 2003 master plan, which was trying to gear it towards more of an office park type setting. The Wireless Overlay District also was created during that time period to address the cellular towers. And then we had added ground-mounted solar facilities, most recently, I think, within the last 3 or 4 years to the zoning bylaw. So again, a lot of this stuff came out of the diagnostics, the zoning diagnostic that was done, but in general, it was found that the boards and staff were doing a good job with the tools that we had, and that it was hard to get people excited about zoning until something is in their backyard. We also had to recognize that the market itself matters, and I think we saw this with the overlay districts on Route 38 and I refer to those because those are the ones that I think most people see, but there are other overlay districts that are elsewhere in town. And then we had little used or never used regulations that could lead to unintended consequences. So here's some of the challenges, which is that, you know, there are some people in town that believe that there are too many condos and apartments. Route 38 improvements have been advancing, but the question is, could town be doing better with the development that's occurring there? And then the overlays themselves kind of signaled the policy decision to encourage growth and better design on Route 38, and then we needed to really figure out what is a good design outcome. Other challenges included the sign bylaw, which, again, being involved back in 2002, I think that we didn't make a lot of changes to the pre-existing section of the bylaw that addressed signs, and there were a lot of conflicts in there, and then there was a significant Supreme Court case that came down probably, I think it's 3 years ago now, that really needed to be looked at to make sure that we were in compliance with that Supreme Court decision. The question on the second bullet, does the town need more than one single-family residential zone? I addressed this earlier in that we were looking at parcels in certain sections of town that could possibly have a different type of zoning designation. Just for everybody's edification, we have an R40 district, which is 1 acre zoning, but I think everyone is aware of those areas of town where there is less than acre house lots on pre-existing neighborhoods. So this was kind of a question that came up. I think it's something worthy of taking a deeper look at, but just not at this time. How could the town encourage more good investment along Route 38 and reduce developers' risk? That is something that you have to take into consideration when looking at zoning or permitting or development, is that we can change zoning, but we may not get the desired outcomes because it just doesn't work from the developer's perspective. And you have to we just have to understand that and do that balance. So there are a significant number of trade-offs. So the results were that we would replace the existing commercial districts on Route 38 with more than one business district, and those types of uses would be based on the overlays that are there. This all goes back to, again, the 2003 master plan that was taken to town meeting and approved. We had, I think it was 5 different districts or concept districts that were outlined in that master plan. The premier one being the town center, needing a different type of district than what you would find up at Walmart or what you would find down at South and Salem. It's just, they're different characters with these sections of Route 38. Today, Route 38 still exists as a single-zoned district from the Lowell line all the way down to the Wilmington line, 291 feet off of the center line of Route 38. The overlays came in about 2009 and tried to address what was in the master plan, calling for these character districts. And again, we kind of got a flavor of how that was going to operate and what uses could be allowed. So in this draft of what we're proposing, you're really looking at taking those overlays and dropping them down in place, and then changing or at least refining some of the uses that are allowed, or how those uses would work with abutting properties. Then it was a look at cleaning up the structures, definitions, and language, and improving the navigability of the bylaw itself. So these are some examples of the changes. There was added and revised some of the existing definitions. There's like definitions are now grouped together so that it's easier to find. And all of the definitions are in section 2 and not scattered throughout the bylaw. Site plan review was introduced for both by right and special permit uses, allowing for both minor site plan reviews at the administrative level, and then for major site plan reviews, those would occur at the planning board level. The districts, you'll see that the overlay districts were reduced from 11 to 4. And then the business districts were increased from 2 to 6. And again, that goes back to what I was saying about Route 38 and trying to create these character districts. So what we have currently for business districts is the commercial district, and there's a limited business district. And the additional 4 districts that were created kind of picked up where the overlay districts were. And then on design standards, there are now town center design standards that were developed with an architect and his eye to how design should be accomplished for quality projects. Each district that allows for multifamily or mixed use now has a density cap. There's a number of overlays that have been used in the past that did not have caps on the density. That is now in the bylaw with the individual districts. The fee in lieu of has generated a lot of conversation, and the committee finally came down on there being a mandatory requirement for the affordable units to be provided on site for multifamily developments, and then for those projects that are the open space residential design subdivisions, there is the ability to still provide a fee in lieu of providing those units on site. The map will be much easier to read with less overlays and easier to update, as we've now shifted to a parcel-derived map for the districts themselves. And then there was a significant update to the sign section of the bylaw. Moving forward, what we're looking at is on June 20th to have a public session where we will be having a dialogue with the public as far as any specific questions they have on the bylaw. And we'll have people there to answer those questions. Most likely that event will take place at the Senior Center on June 25th. There'll be a public session back here at Town Hall. Through July and August, we're looking to run possibly 3 to 4 cable shows to kind of explain section by section the bylaw, the proposed bylaw itself. In August, we're looking at meeting the warrant deadline to submit for the October town meeting. September, there will be an additional public session for people returning from the summer. September is also the planning board's public hearing on zoning articles prior to town meeting. And then the October special town meeting is where we will hopefully be bringing this for a vote. So with that, I'm leaving it for discussion with the planning board, board of selectmen. If you have questions, I can answer them, or I have Judy and Bob sitting up here with me so that they can assist if there's something that I may get stumped on. And I think, again, we have 2 members of the zoning bylaw committee that are on the planning board and the selectmen, and there's 1 other member from the committee that's in the audience. So if there's policy questions that come up, they may be able to help in answering those questions.
Questions?
I have questions.
Jane does.
Go first.
Always make the new girl go
Can you try and grab the mic? Yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is that good? All right. Thank you. 3 years of doing this work is substantial on behalf of our community, and I want to thank you and all the members past and present for the work that you've done. It's quite an undertaking. And having read it a few times and somewhat familiar with the old bylaws, this is a lot of heavy lifting, one might say. I just wanted to ask you a few high-level questions, and then a couple of more specific ones. Can you kind of go over what the changes are to multifamily developments that you've changed from our understanding in the past to this new version?
I think I'm going to pull, just to make it easier, I think I'm going to pull that section of the bylaw up.
Okay.
Just so that people can see it.
regulations are all district standards. So it's really, it's section 4. The dimensional regulations are first and the use regulations follow. So if you go to section 532, you have the dimensional regulations.
That's about a week old. Today. Basically the same.
Sorry, I'm getting that.
It's 8:02, 8.2. Look how much work you did. This is fantastic.
Here we go.
Okay.
So here you'll see, again, these are the dimensional requirements for the residential districts. And where you see the MF there, it's 1 acre is the minimum lot size. There's 2 different types of multifamily, but it's 4 acres for multifamily housing, the minimum of 150 feet of frontage. I don't think you'll find that much different than what we see in the existing bylaw. The heights are consistent with what's in the existing bylaw. And then I think those are the most significant portions of it.
There are also in the use regulations. I don't
Can you
know.
speak into the microphone? I can't hear you.
Sorry, I'm sorry. You probably want to also open up the Appendix A, the use regulations.
Okay.
We currently have the use regulations in a separate document just because of the orientation of the page. That will all get integrated ultimately.
So, thank you, Judy. Here in the use regulations, multifamily under residential, we start with the multifamily dwellings up to 8 units is allowed by right in the multifamily district. And then 9 or more units would be allowed by special permit. That is a bit of a change existing right now. We have 7 units that are allowed in the multifamily district. And that 7 units is allowed by special permit. In both instances, the inclusionary zoning is a component of that, so 15%. And under this bylaw, the 15% would be mandated to be in the development itself.
Okay. Can you talk to us a little bit about how your mixed-use development may have changed?
When you say mixed-use development,
Well, you know what I mean.
the definition, or, because there's different districts that allow for mixed use.
Okay,
Do you want to start with the definition?
sure.
I think it may be easier to just
No,
read it myself, but only because,
there's been a lot of discussion in the community about mixed-use development and giving the tools to the planning board that they need to,
Yep.
shape it a little better in the future. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. So the definition seems like a good place to start.
So the definition is a building containing more than one use or a development with two or more buildings containing more than one use. For a mixed-use building in a non-residential district, the ground floor, the ground floor of the front facade shall be allowed only for non-residential uses.
Right.
So let me explain that. So in a mixed-use building, in a vertical building, if there is to be residential on the first floor, it cannot be on the front facade of the building,
The street side?
the street side.
Okay.
Only to keep it storefront focused. And then, and I think this is, again, this was kind of a policy decision, and I believe that it's a carryover from the existing bylaw, which allows for two or more buildings containing more than one use on the site. This is what traditional mixed use is always considered vertical. That's what people think of. They think of retail, commercial on the first floor or second floor, and residential above. Horizontal mixed use gives you commercial up front and then residential in the back. And we've seen that. And I think that the way that this definition reads is that it would still allow for that type of use, which is one of those carryovers from the existing bylaw.
Okay. And the other question I wanted to ask you about, I noticed there was some language in there for shared parking, I was reading the parking, and I don't know how that compares to the previous bylaw, but for some of our restaurants that are in dense areas in town, sort of in the center of town, they're limited in their capacity by the land of the parking that's available to them, because there's not a lot of land. So I'm wondering if there's some ability to use that shared parking philosophy to enable some of our restaurants to increase their capacity during their, evening hours or their busy hours, when their shared parking is not, neighbor parking isn't necessarily being used in other businesses nearby, using those same adjustments. It didn't seem to reference it in the restaurant parking requirements, i.e. one parking spot required for every 2 seats. But with the shared parking sort of philosophy that I saw there, it seems to me the reference would be possible for some of our businesses.
Getting there.
We have remote.
Is that
park-
okay? What do
We
you
have
think?
remote parking and shared, Steve. It's 616.
Yep, so for, it'd be nice if I could scroll quickly to the section,
ahead.
but,
It's the beauty of the electronics.
It's fine. Go ahead so people can see it. We're good.
Got to go back to the bylaw and do that.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to. Was this in the previous bylaw, the shared parking piece?
there is shared parking
Okay.
in bylaw.
It is now, that's my question. Before, it wasn't from before, it is now. All right, thank you.
I'll get to it. Wow.
Is that new? Seems new.
Control F shared.
Control what?
Control F shared.
Oh, it's right there, 616. Just write down 6,
It's 2 more sections. I
Two
think.
more sections?
and then 6. 6.1.6. Yep.
Yeah, so there's shared and there's remote shared.
I remember some discussion about the shared parking when we talked about doing the center over again, and in using, bank parking for evening events and so forth on the common, stuff like that.
Right, so And so here you can see for shared parking, that we're looking at where they're not overlapping peak parking demands for those uses. And it puts it on the applicant to show the difference, the operating hours of the two different uses and other similar factors that would be used to justify their approval, the planning board's approval for the shared space.
So a business could, under this bylaw, conceivably come forward and say, I'd like to increase my seating capacity in my restaurant during
Yes.
business hours, provided it can meet all of these things.
Yep.
Okay, all right, thank you.
If I could just add, just as you can see up there, it's for non-residential shared parking, non-residential remote parking, but it's not specified use by use. It's up to the planning board to.
Sure.
So
Sure.
a restaurant could come in, or
Something else.
a movie theater in an office building, or something like that. So it's flexible.
Right, thank you. No,
That's
thank you
what
for
we-
that distinction.
Some of the updates to this bylaw is to try to provide some flexibility to the boards that are reviewing these
Mm-hmm.
various developments.
Well, and as we become more and more dense, it allows us to have more use along that space and for businesses to meet their client needs. Thank you, those are my questions for now.
I guess I have a couple of simple questions. I guess kind of taking a step back. So this has to go before town meeting, right, in the fall? So this is confusing. There's a lot. And for those that don't understand it and trying to absorb it, what's the plan, I guess, to make sure that, I know there's going to be plenty of meetings, and people need to attend and understand, but I know like zoning bylaw changes is very difficult to discuss on the floor of town meeting. Not to go down, be negative or try to go down a rat hole, but what's the plan to make sure there's controlled discussion on the floor and it's, you know what I mean, it's understood? Because this is definitely needed, all the hard work over 3 years, and I guess I wouldn't want to see it to go to waste on a vote.
Right, so I grabbed the 2002 annual town report from the town meeting that the last recodification occurred. And the moderator had it structured kind of the same way that we do the bylaw, or I mean the budget, where it's sections and then allowing people to call out if they want to debate.
Okay,
So
yeah.
there are some sections that are not discussed because no one wanted to debate those things. And then we take up those sections during,
So you're going to try to control it like we do with the budget?
yeah,
Yeah.
that type of framework.
Okay. That's good to know.
And the other thing, and I don't disagree, it does get confusing. And the hard thing here was really to do an apples-to-apples comparison or to do a red line strikeout of the existing bylaw, because we're changing a numbering system and we're moving things to different locations. So what we're going to do is we will put together a matrix so that people can look at the existing bylaw and say, here's section 5,000, which talks about 5,200, which talks about signs, and then they can go find where that is in the new bylaw. So that's one of the things that we're going to put on that matrix, and then the other thing would be what the changes are. Now that's a little bit more challenging, but that's something that we have to do really, because it just helps people understand what's going on.
Yeah.
And then the way that the warrant article itself was written was that it actually talked about the old sections that were going to be replaced with the new section. And so each one of those boxes were different sections of the article. So as we were going down, we would say replace section 1 with the following and renumber and replace section 1.5 with new section 9100. So that's going to add, hopefully, people's understanding of what the change is, how you look at these two things together.
Good. So you've, obviously you've put a lot of thought into how to present this, and what a task ahead of you to do that.
If I could just add one thing, in all the public outreach and when you get to town meeting, one of the things that helps people understand is for people to understand that this is not a complete rewrite of your existing bylaw. A lot of the language in this new draft comes directly from the existing draft. As Steve pointed out, you've adopted a lot of new language over different topics in the last decade. That language was good language. You know, we're not changing it, we're just bringing it over. So a lot of this has been pointed out is just kind of cleaning it up, getting it better organized, getting it, you know, things simple as, you know, having tables and putting things in alphabetical order so people can navigate the bylaw with some new language. But it's a recodification with some changes as opposed to a complete rewrite.
Right.
So they'll see a lot of familiar language if they want to get into the weeds, as Steve pointed out.
And I guess that comment that you made, you know, would put people at ease that it's not, you know, things aren't being slipped in, or, you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
you've thought about how to present it, I'm sure, so.
Right, and we owe it to the voting body to explain what those changes are, so that there's, so that
Fantastic.
nothing is viewed as being underhanded or trying to slip something in.
Yeah, not being negative like that, but I just know how difficult it is to discuss that on the floor of town meeting. So I guess I'm an insurance guy, so I don't know all this stuff, but I know insurance, no. If I had a lot and it was an acre lot, I can build on that lot right now, right? If I wanted to split that lot, how do I do that? Or can I do that with the new bylaw? Is that,
Depends on the district.
Yeah.
Depends on district.
It would depend on the
Depends on the
district.
district.
but I can do that in some of the districts. I could split that lot and build on that
We,
lot?
we didn't change the rule that we have for residential right now.
Nothing's
which is
changed.
that you're not going to split a 1 acre lot in a residential neighborhood.
Can't do it.
No. And that's been standard practice in town since, I think the early 90s.
Yeah. So I knew there's those rules, and I'm just trying to understand a little
Right.
bit better. But is
but-
there any changes to, if you had an existing home and you had some land and you wanted to maybe think about if you could build something on that land, is there any changes in the new bylaw, or is it
No.
depending-
But this point that I had brought up earlier about us looking at upzoning different areas of town, so if you had an acre in an area that was rezoned to half-acre zoning, then you would have some development opportunities.
Gotcha.
But that section of the bylaw, because it was a previous commitment to not allow for lot splits, we carried that forward.
in the new bylaw?
Yeah.
Is there a zone that I would be able to do that if, there's no zone? Okay.
No. And when Judy said it depended on what zone you were in, it was because 1 acre is the standard for residential. It is the standard for some others, but then there are other districts that have less than an acre. And that's because again, goes back to how the overlays work. So
Yep.
it's more of the commercial zoned properties that you would see that would have less than an acre.
Okay, thanks. I had two other quick questions. So, looks like there's a lot of discussion about the Route 38 business zoning. So I'm assuming that it's going to help promote business growth on 38? Is there any like, wow, this is going to be great and we can spruce it up? Or what was the goal, I guess, on the business zoning in a nutshell?
Yeah, I think, again, I'm going to go back to the overlays and say that as far as the areas of Route 38, the boundaries are pretty close to the same as to where the overlays are. it was more of looking at those uses and the dimensional requirements and kind of making sure that they made sense for the district. Not to say that the overlays don't, but it was more of just a double check on what would work in the market. And then, like I said, the town center design guidelines, I think, would be helpful and beneficial to those that are developing in town center in helping achieve what I think people have been saying for years. Again, the 2003 master plan, the 2016 master plan, the vision plan, everybody talks about a town center, but yet it's very difficult to achieve. So we're trying to right-size everything with those design guidelines, which means that the bylaw has to match up to that as far as massing on site and other dimensional requirements.
Okay. And then the last thing is, you said you did a lot on signs. That's on like all over town, I guess, but mainly Route 38. And is there like a sign cleanup type of thing? Because I know there's all sorts of different sizes, shapes. I noticed like the Tewksbury Credit Union just put a new dandy-looking sign that seemed to conform to a certain standard. Is there an effort to clean up the 38 with signs?
I'm turning to Bob because Bob spent a
Bob's
lot
the
of
sign
time.
guy.
He spent a lot of time on the sign.
The sign section actually had a lot of conversation at the committee meetings, over many meetings. And so there was a variety of issues and topics. And one was, you used the word cleanup. I'm not sure exactly what you meant, but that term got
Well,
used.
I guess, let me clarify that. So there's old-looking signs from 1943, and then there's newer signs for 2019. So how do we get businesses to maybe think about that in the future or whatever?
So there's a couple of things. Some were small additions to the bylaw that might have a bigger effect. So we added a maintenance requirement into the bylaw that would give the building inspector the power to go out there and, signs are falling down or, they haven't been used in a long time. So there was something in writing that would back up the idea of you need to maintain your signs. There's new language in there about certain signs you have to provide landscaping around the bottom of the signs, and just don't stick them in the middle of a piece of asphalt or something like that. I mean, we heard a lot of, in the whole conversation about Route 28 in the town center, we heard a lot about sort of design concerns from citizens and people and how it looked. And so that was a lot of the conversations. One of the things that has been added that came up through the committee, although we heard it from, Judy and I interviewed a lot of people that both in town hall and outside the town hall that work with the bylaw or develop in town or attorneys in town, just to get perspective. So one of the things we heard a lot about was better looking signs. So one of the things that you allow are freestanding signs, but most of your freestanding signs are a pole with a sign on top. And people asked us to see if we could put language in there, if this is acceptable to the town, to allow what's called monument signs, which some of the surrounding communities have, which the signs are actually on a wall or on a fence, again, out towards the edge of the road, but they tend to be lower in height, and although they might still have the same amount of square footage for the business people, but
Not so obtrusive. Not so obtrusive.
so again, providing some flexibility, and there was some incentive to do that. The way it's written is you get a slightly bigger sign if you put a monument sign with landscaping and whatnot, rather than a pole and a sign.
Right.
So some of the changes were related to those kinds of concerns about
Okay.
what it looked, without hurting the business people. We're not, saying you can't use signs.
Right.
And then the other thing was what Steve mentioned, the Supreme Court case that came down a number of years, very much limits how towns everywhere in the entire country can restrict what they call non-commercial speech signs. So a lot of bylaws, and yours was like one, will have a religious institution can have a sign of this big, and a home occupation can have a sign of that size, and a school can have a sign of this big. And what the Supreme Court says, that's a violation of the First Amendment, because you're determining the size of the sign based on the speech
Right.
that's on the sign. And so we had to kind of massage your sign bylaw to get to a point where we allow those kinds of uses to have signs without saying, well, you're a church and you're a temple and you're a school and you're, it's a delicate dance because for a lot of reasons, not the least of which the Supreme Court, although it was a 5-4 vote, I think there was 7 different opinions about what towns can and can't do. And courts since then have been struggling to kind of interpret the Supreme Court's decision. So it's a moving target.
Okay.
But to where we are now, to the best of our ability, and Bob Ritchie and myself have been researching and staying on top of this. So we're trying to make your sign bylaw not violate the First Amendment, which is a critical piece.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I do, Steve, think that zoning bylaw is exciting. I'm in the field of insurance, so it's just a step above that.
You tell my boss that.
Mr. Montori, I appreciate all the hard work, and I know this is very confusing to present and show off to everybody, and I look forward to the consistent and strong communication moving forward up to town meeting, and anything that I can do to help, I'd be glad to. So thank you very much for allowing me to ask those maybe elementary questions, but thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian.
So I'm a step below him. I'm in kindergarten,
You may have to turn that on.
okay? Good luck with that.
Amber, use this one.
Thank you. It was a long night last night. So he just said that he's elementary, I'm kindergarten, and when it comes to zoning and these bylaws. And I guess for me, I do think that this work needed to be done, and I think it's really important for our town. But as somebody who tries to understand it and then tries to answer people's questions about that, that's challenging for me. So I was very glad to hear my colleagues' questions, especially about how we were going to present. And I also was thinking about redundancies that I know that you've addressed within the policies. And while I know it's very confusing when you're changing the numbering and the layout, and people want a red line document, but a red line document isn't really going to get them to where you need to understand exactly what the changes are, I was thinking in terms of how we could look at kind of what we are removing for redundancies and what benefits that we're getting, because I think it's really important for the transparency, to your point, Steve, about we owe it to our voters to do this and explain it. But even if we're explaining it, because I've been doing a lot of work on these for a long time, and I still don't feel like I'm in first or second grade. And I've been to a lot of meetings that are talking about these things, and I know that a lot of times people want to say, yeah, I understand that, because they don't want to say that they don't understand it. And really, for me, what it comes down to is how we defined how this is beneficial. Jane's questions were great because you talked about the flexibility that has been brought into these bylaws that was not there before, that our businesses can take advantage of. So that's a great thing that we would say was a benefit. But what are the actual benefits, real life, if there's a way for us to explain those, I think that that would be really beneficial. I think about the work that the town manager does with the, speak to the warrant articles. I don't know if there's a way for us to do those in short things so that as somebody's following along with this in that presentation, that there's a way to do that. So not that I'm asking you to do another task, I'm just thinking about another way of presenting it that might be helpful to residents that may not feel comfortable reading it and getting the full grasp, because every single one of these is connected to somewhere else in the bylaw. And so you read something and you think, oh, I got that. But if you didn't read the whole bylaw section or how it relates to another section that also is impacted, you miss the point. And those are the kind of things that I worry about when we're doing this, is the transparency of that. And when we're talking about the acreage and the things that people know to be true and that are remaining true, there are some real staples to that. You know, the buffers are another thing that I think is a staple, right? These are things that people have in their head. They already know them. They already think they know them. They may be right, they may be wrong, but if we were able to call those things out, to your point, Bob, about this has already been there and we're not changing that because this was good for the town before and it's still good for the town. So I don't have any questions per se. I am absolutely looking forward to hearing people's feedback and looking forward to help you present this, because I do think that this is going to be a daunting task to get people to understand it. I think the people that have gone to the meetings up to now have a very strong interest in zoning. We have to get to the people who don't have an interest in zoning so that they understand why this was needed. And I will love to help you with that piece, but I don't have any questions. I just want to thank you for your efforts, because I think that this has been a real heavy lift. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, so am I next? All right, so I think I fall someplace just above the elementary and somewhere above that somewhere. So, yeah, somewhere above it, I guess, but I'll echo what everybody said about the amount of work that's gone into it, only because it's going to sound like in a second that I don't appreciate that, but it's not my intention. I have concerns with this. One, just as was pointed out and were noticed in the last few seconds, the difficulty of the people who actually know this stuff to even find some of these sections when someone asks a question about it goes to the point of why, if you couldn't have a red line, which really would have been needed, the matrix stuff is something that we needed now, because I know a lot of this and I can't find the sections and what happened and how they've changed. And I come here every 2 weeks and deal with this. So that's a problem. The removal of not doing things like dealing with like what would be referred to as like an R10 district at this point. Saying that we'll bring it back later, I think misses the point of making these changes as one big zoning change, because the very first thing that's going to be said the night we bring in an R10 zone is, why didn't you do this when you just changed the bylaw? You just did it. So, you look at South Tewksbury, that's where you're probably talking about like an R10 district, okay? You'd have to knock down 5 or 6 houses to build, and for visual purposes, an acre lot is a football field, minus its end zones, with frontage that's the distance from one sideline to the other sideline of a football field. That's what R40 zoning is. There is no way that R40 zoning should still be the zoning of South Tewksbury, for example. And the fact that that's the case is why we have to deal with 40B, because this anti-snob zoning, which is what it is, was the result of making acre-sized lots everywhere, because you don't want people to have a house that doesn't have the back 40, of the ponderosa that you have to mow to every house. That's ridiculous. 150 feet of frontage You can't throw something, most people, from one end of that to the other. Stand on one side of a football field and throw something to the other side. Can you? No, most people can't. That's ridiculous, 150 feet of frontage. And then a football field going back from there, everywhere. 6 houses, at least, you'd have to knock down in South Tewksbury to have one conforming lot. That's ridiculous. And when we go to try and bring it into the town meeting by itself, 3/4 of the town is going to say, no. It has to be 40, it has to be 150 feet of frontage and, you know, an acre. You're not going to get, like, it's hard enough to deal with the zoning stuff as it is. That's one of the questions I want to ask. There's confusion, because I've asked this sort of, and I don't know what the answer is now. Is the zoning bylaw an all or nothing passage, or is it section by section?
It's being presented as an all or nothing.
Right, but I've asked that question on things before where I've asked in advance, is it all or nothing? And then we get to town meeting, and all of a sudden, it's not all or nothing. That makes a difference.
It's being-
Because if people start pulling sections out and changing them, to Ms. Stronach's comment, that has effects all across the bylaw. If you can pull things out that you may or may not even understand what they are to begin with, and then what they might change otherwise. So that's a serious distinction that needs to be determined before we get there, you know, by a decision from town council before the fact. Like, we can't get to town meeting and have sections being yanked out of the bylaw
Right.
on the floor with no one knowing it's going to happen. So that, I'm just throwing that out there. I'm not expecting an answer right now, but I'm just saying, we need to know, is it all or nothing? Are we going to run through this thing? You can discuss it section by section. But if you're going to start pulling sections out in the middle of town meeting, I mean, just imagine what that's going to devolve into.
Yep.
You know, it's hard enough when people really understand a topic. This is difficult. This stuff is really hard to do. And if you have people making amendments on the floor, I mean, it's going to get ugly, and it's going to get ugly fast. So that's a decision, someone's going to have to get an answer on that well in advance. You know, there are a lot of more specific things, like, you know, I've said this since the beginning, that, you know, I lived this from the planning board side, so that's my approach to this. My concerns are turning the planning board into a rubber stamp for these decision makings. There's a reason, I feel, and this might be my own personal opinion, there's a reason why the things in Tewksbury have gone the way they have, as opposed to places like Winchester, Stoneham, Reading, who have 40B projects dropped on them left and right, because they don't have the flexibility or are unwilling to use it to try and make sensible decisions. So instead, they just get things jammed down their throat. We had meetings in here for a project that was going to be a 40B project on Astor Street, and the town went bonkers. We didn't even have any control over it anymore, because once it became a 40B project, it went to the Zoning Board of Appeals and the Board of Selectmen. But even going to those boards, they were going to get whatever it was, if that person went forward with it, jammed down the throat, because there's not much you can do about a 40B except for waste town funds by trying to sue for it in court and losing, because you're going to lose. It's that simple. You're going to waste time and money. You might delay a project, but it's coming. Ask Winchester, ask Stoneham, ask Reading, ask North Reading. When was the last time one happened here? Yep, nobody's going to give you a date, because it predates me being on the board, and about the only person who could possibly have been there would have been Bob, because he's been there for 30 years. But there's a reason for that. Now, I have no problem with the lip ones, you know, where it's cooperative. That's fine. But that's not what I'm talking about. And that's not what's going to happen when you get your new census and you get back into a new 10-year period, and we have no control over those things at the beginning. And if the board is put in a position where we can no longer work with anyone because we don't have decision-making, because I scroll through this thing, we've lost waiver power all throughout the section. We've lost decision-making power all throughout this thing. Now, like it or not, the planning board's an elected board in this town. We're elected to make decisions. We're not up there to just rubber stamp stuff every 2 weeks. So if that's what this is going to do, I'm never going to be okay with this, even for the good things that are in here, because it's going to come back and bite the town in the ass when someone comes in here to one of our public meetings and says, why can't you do anything about this? Why does that look like that? Well, it looks like that because we weren't able to have any kind of give and take, because we had it removed from our power to make any kind of a waiver or anything that made it cooperative with a developer who's going to turn around and say, forget it. I'm just going to go do a 40B project, because then I don't have to meet any like requirements of what it looks like or anything else, because you can't stop me. I mean, it's just, like I said, I understand, I'm fine with, cleaning up the sections. That's all fine. But these absolutes versus flexibility don't make sense to me. You want to up the decision-making on waivers to 3/4 or 4/5, whatever. I don't care. If it makes sense, then I expect 4 out of 5 of the people on the board should be able to agree on it anyways. That's fine. But the removal of the ability to grant waivers on certain things, the ability to make a decision on certain things, is problematic, and it's going to be problematic going forward. Someone else here already mentioned, or actually it was on Steve's slide, it's hard to get anybody interested in zoning until it happens in their backyard. Well, that's when people show up, and they're going to be stunned when they come down here thinking that they can make a comment or make a complaint, and we have to look at them with blank stares because there's nothing for us to do about it. It's a problem. And like I said, without the red line, I can't even see where all of that's happening. I'm just thumbing through the thing. I go into the parking requirements section. There are a whole bunch of requirements in there where the planning board was going to make a decision if there wasn't already a number of parking put in. Now it's switched to the building inspector. Nothing against the building inspector. However, that's one person making a decision, however they feel, and that's that. Whereas when it was in the planning board, you're going to come before 5 people who are going to listen to it, make a decision, and they were going to be able to have taken in comments from the building inspector or whomever else that wants to weigh in on it before that decision's made. You've got this minor site plan review. I've disliked this from the beginning. However, the way it's set up now, at least at the end, you can appeal to the planning board if you don't like the decision you got. That part, now I'm fine. That's great. The only thing I'd suggest or request is that you give applicants the opportunity to bypass that person and go to the planning board on their own if they want, for 2 reasons. One, the time frame in this thing, I assume that this was set up to make things quicker. One of the times where we agreed that we live in the 21st century, not the 18th century, because things meant to happen faster than once or twice a year. So that's fine, but there's a 45-day period here where someone might not get a decision before it gets kicked up to the planning board because whoever this designee finally decides, never mind, I'll send it to the planning board. We could have had 3 meetings scheduled in that time and given whoever that was an answer. So, that's just a suggestion for, it's fine if you want to leave it and they just appeal, but the quickness of it seems to be eliminated if it takes the full time that's allowed in here and then you still get a decision that you're not agreeing with. It's now coming up, by the time they get in front of us, now it's 60 days out. And the whole idea was this was minor. And now it just took what would have been 4 of our meetings before a decision can get made. You mentioned the zoning map. I don't think it was in this stuff, but we've had a lot of parcels that have come up over and over and over again before us for different things or before the town for different things. How much of that has been addressed at this point? I guess the best way to refer to them is problematic parcels that, have sat empty for a long time, and the zoning on them doesn't seem to fit anything that anyone wants to do. So I don't know how much that has been addressed. I can't tell from this.
They weren't looked at as problem parcels. It was more from a strict planning perspective. Now, I'll give you an example. The Highway Corridor Overlay District is removed because the underlying district there is R40, and that's down at Jenny's Way and South Street. Mm-hmm. So it's removed in this draft, which takes out a commercial component, but it's honoring that underlying zoning, which is the R40, until there's an interchange built there, which has been well over 15 years of not happening. It just made sense to make it R40. I don't know what other parcels.
So, for
you had in
example,
mind.
like the research zoning.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm not sure at this point how much research zoning applications we've had in front of us for anybody to actually use that as a way to build out on a parcel. But yet we have it on parcels. So it doesn't seem like something that makes sense going forward, but I don't know, maybe it does, but maybe I'm wrong, but it just seems like those are the kind of things that like have made parcels not buildable because it's a use list that doesn't translate to anyone that they want to use. So parcels just sit empty.
Yeah, so some of the use regulations for that district have changed.
So, I mean, I think that goes back to my original point, which is it's really difficult to follow where things have changed and who's making the decisions for sections because they've moved all over the place. The only thing that's redlined in here is the definition section. It's the only place where you can see things condensed and/or changed versus the old definition sections, because it's the only section that's marked out that way. You know, like I said, I'm not, obviously it needs to get done. You know, those, you know, the slide earlier that showed the overlay districts and whatnot that were done, or the zoning changes that were done between the last one and this one, obviously means that this needs to be updated. That makes sense. You know, the reasons those were done was because piecemeal with the situation made more sense than trying to redo the whole zoning book at the time. Now it's time to bring those things into the book correctly. That makes sense. But I think leaving out things just because they're not the easiest thing to settle right now, like the R10 district, for example, it's just kicking a can down the road for something that has been wrong since '56, because that part of town has looked like that forever. And to tell the people down there that you're perpetually non-conforming because, you know, your section of town is different, but we're treating you like every other parcel, when that doesn't make sense.
So the committee said that they were going to postpone working on that, and when we had talked to some residents in other sections of town, there was discussion about trying to get at the town meeting. Again, really what you're doing is you're looking at a map and you're saying, this document is probably 120 pages long. What you're talking about is adding into the dimensional table for an R10 that it's a quarter acre, what the setback is going to be, what the open space requirement is going to be on that, and what the building height is. That's all that change is, and then it shows up on the map. So it's something that can be done. It's easy to integrate into the bylaw. It's the level of analysis that needs to be done. Now, I'm a huge proponent of trying to change that zoning down in South Tewksbury, and I think that it's been long overdue that be corrected. What happened was we looked at 11 different areas of town that had less than 1 acre lots in residential areas and started saying, well, how many buildable lots are we creating by changing the zoning from 1 acre to a half acre or 1 acre to a quarter acre? And what's that going to do to that neighborhood there once you say, you know what, we've just changed you to a quarter acre, and oh, by the way, there's 6 new lots in this neighborhood now that have just become buildable lots that can have development go on them. So, I mean, those are the types of analysis that we did.
I understand that point, though, but that's sort of like, it'll go back to like, you know, this thing is littered with the, you know, what's the intention? Like, there's new definitions of intention for these zones, you know, what we're trying to accomplish. And you keep seeing the, you know, keeping in with the, you know, the surrounding areas, and, you know, that it fits with what's there. Well, but that's my point. That is what's there. You know, so having those kind of zones, I understand it may create buildable lots, but why is that bad, is I guess my point, because that is what that neighborhood looks like. So I understand that, like, it's, I guess I don't understand, that the difficulty is that it may actually result in being able to build things in that part of town that at present you can't do because someone told you that you're supposed to have a football field worth of space. I think that it should be the result of that change, is that people can actually build something that will be conforming, as opposed to continually sitting with, you know, non-conforming lots that are just grandfathered forever and ever and ever. And, you know, if it burns down, build it back up on its, you know, on its foundation, because that's the footprint you're stuck with. And, you know, I just don't see how that that should be as problematic. You know, maybe you can't take into account every place it should probably go, but it seems like that area is already telling us that that's where it should go.
I don't disagree with you. I mean, I'll take that back to the committee.
I just feel like the whole point is doing something. It's been over a decade, well, actually closer to 2 decades since this has been done. If we're going to do it, put the stuff in it that needs to be there, that hasn't been addressed and should have already been addressed. That's, I guess, my point, is that we're going through all this effort to put together what should then last us for, I don't know, maybe not 20 years, but you know, I don't like the idea that we're basically going to turn right around and say, hey, we're bringing in a zoning amendment to the zoning bylaw that we just passed. Believe us, we really think it's important. We just didn't then.
The
Do now.
only thing, right, and the only thing I would say is that to address that issue, it's really addressing a 70-year-old issue.
I guess that's my point, is that in 70 years, one would think we should be at a point now we should address it,
Yeah,
not 70 plus.
I'll talk.
1, 5, 10.
I'll talk to the committee.
You know, so, I mean, again, my whole point too is I think these absolutes are going to ultimately be problematic, and people are going to regret that, you know, we've changed things to the point where, you know, you don't leave the leeway that you once had to make decisions, to come to accommodations with developers when they come in to do things that I think are going to have unintended consequences that people are going to be extremely unhappy with, as a trade-off to trying to remove decision-making because people don't like some decisions that have been made. I think that's a mistake. I think it's short-sighted, and I think it's going to be a problem. So, thank you.
Mr. Crabbe?
I'll wait, I'll continue down the board. I'll let you gentlemen continue.
Mr. Ryder?
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. I will echo everyone else. Great job by everyone. I think it will be difficult, as Mr. Johnson stated, that for some people not seeing a red line version. Most people, when they see a document change, they're used to a red line version or some sort of highlighted change version. By not doing that, it's going to confuse a lot of people. It confused me. I was going back and forth from an electronic document to a paper document, flipping pages, trying to go back and see what match. And as Mr. Johnson stated, I sit here every couple weeks and try and make a judgment on what we think is right for the town. And it's real difficult, and getting the residents, as you stated, it's very, you know, it is a little boring. But to get people involved, you may need to go that extra step and try and create a document that brings some sort of excitement to it, or some sort of want a buy-in from the town. And sitting on the elementary school building committee, there were multiple documents that were created to get that excitement. And that ultimately resulted in a positive vote at the town meeting. I don't think if that wasn't done, I don't think we would have had that positive outcome. And I'm concerned that that's going to happen with this. I really think if we don't go that extra step, and you know, that committee had another body supporting that. You know, you have what you guys are doing, and you know, the planning board and the board of selectmen helping to support this, but we need that extra documentation to really give that power to the residents to see exactly what's being changed, because from the regular resident, they're not going to know the difference, what was there before and what's there now. And if they do first or second glance, they're going to say, I don't understand this. I don't know what I'm talking about. They're going to ask me, or they'll ask another person on this board, and we're going to have a hard time explaining it. So I think anything we can do is, it's going to pay at that town meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Cooper.
I would just state that Mr. Cuco, Mr. Fowler, and Mr. Kratman make up a quorum of the zoning bylaw committee, and the meeting was posted for you tonight.
I'm just going to be very brief. It would be easy to do that if we just said, okay, Section 3 was Section 9100, and just have people jump back and forth. They're not going to understand it one way or the other. When you look at this bylaw, the thing that jumps out with me, the only thing that's new is site plan review. Everything else has been in the bylaw. We haven't added anything new. We've shuffled the cards up and redealt them, some from the top, some from the middle. So we've tried to make it simplified. But really, there isn't, it's not a document that's got a bunch of new stuff in it. Site plan review and some administrative issues that we empowered to the building commissioner or a group that is designated by the town manager, not just the building commissioner, it might be 2 or 3 different people. So everything else in here is pretty much the same, taking out stuff that was legal, illegal. So if you're talking about a red line matrix that said, 5.1 used to be 3,500 and 5.2 used to be 3,600, then somebody can jump back and forth and look at it. But it's impossible to do a line by line because all the cards were taken out. But we could say, purpose and authority, 1.1 used to be section 1,000. 1.2 used to be 1,010. And if you have both documents, paper documents in your hand, you can go back and forth and look. You notice I bring mine in print because you can't flip your pages quick enough on your computer. So that would be my suggestion, is to just say, this section number is now this section number, so that somebody can flip back and forth and see. And when they start to read it, it's almost the exact same language except for some spelling and taking out a lot of areas of error. And one of the things that we were concerned about is the bylaw goes in, there's no taking sections out. The whole bylaw has to go, because how do you take out one section? Then what are you going to do? You're going to take 5.3 out and refer back to section 5,000? You can't do it. So it either sinks or swim on its merits. We'll do the best we can to explain it in the next upcoming forums. And like everything, I say this at all of our hearings, people come to town meeting, they don't understand things. When it comes to the finance committee or when it comes to budgets or anything, they have to come to the public hearings, they have to look on the website, they have to read things, and a lot of their questions will be answered. Looking at it the first time at town meeting, it's not the time to do that. So encourage everyone to look at these documents prior to town meeting. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cooper.
Pass him the microphone.
Mr. Delaney.
Yes, my question is, first of all, I'll go with the rest of the people. The work you've done is pretty good. Okay, you've worked hard. I really appreciate the work you've gone through. There's a couple of things, I think you might have touched on it. One is the sign issue for, is there a parameter that we can go by that governs how big that sign can be? In other words, if Market Basket puts in a store, he can put in a certain size sign. Some pizza shop, he has a size sign. Is there anything in here that governs that type of thing, so that we know what we can approve and can't approve?
Well, just like your existing bylaw, the signs, the size of signs, the location of signs, the height of signs are all regulated. And either those existing sections have been incorporated in the new bylaw, or there were some tweaks to those. As I mentioned, one, there's some additional signs that you can allow, which is the monument sign. And then you may recall the committee had a variety of discussions about how to measure a sign on a wall. Do you measure it the percentage of the wall? Do you measure it by a certain size? And then, of course, you get a building with a big wall, like a market basket, and a wall with a smaller wall with a pizza shop. So, but those regulations were put in either as is or tweaked to give you exactly what your ability is to approve signs based on the type of sign, the zoning district, and those kinds of things.
Okay. The next thing is the density problem with mixed use, like with retail space in a residential. Is there anything in here with the multifamily dwellings of how many units can go to an acre? In other words, we get bombarded with, well, we got 18 units this time, we got 10 units that time. Is there a standard rule of thumb that we can go by of how many units we can put in an acre, say, for retail and residential areas?
You're talking about multifamily dwellings or mixed use? I just want to make sure I understand your
The
question.
thing is, you have multifamily dwellings, like the guy wants to put in 15 townhouses in a 4,000 square foot commercial space.
Mm-hmm.
And he's only got 1.2 acres or 1.6 acres.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a rule of thumb that we can go by, or is it in the zoning that says how many units we can allow him?
I don't think we limited the, usually you don't calculate density in mixed use the way you do for a multifamily dwelling. Typically, this is the amount of building you can do, and a certain amount of it has to be commercial. And the residential space ends up being divided depending on what the parking requirements are and so forth. So with mixed use, it's different from multifamily.
I see.
It's just a different type of activity. So it doesn't lend itself well. I mean, you can have a risk when you start trying to regulate density in mixed-use developments the way you regulate it with a multifamily dwelling, because you can end up sort of forcing somebody into a unit that's too big, for example, because you've said you can only have so many units, but meanwhile, the footprint of the building probably could support more. So it typically is not done that way. It's usually based on just a total amount of building that's on the site, and you have to meet all the other requirements. Whatever you can do within the available space for residential is what you can do. That's typically the way it's done.
Okay, so if I was looking at this report here, how many condos can I build on an acre?
That would be really hard for me to answer, but it's hard to answer that question. You think it's just an acre is an acre, but the shape of the lot can affect how much I can build on that property.
Mr. Levin, just because I think I know what you're trying to ask, I might be sure if way to ask the question.
Go ahead.
So, sorry. So, for example, like because it's something we've had recently, is someone comes in for a mixed-use development, pick a zone, whichever. And in that zone, based on the way the bylaw is written now, that person could possibly ask for their commercial space, and with the waivers that are allowed or whatever, and whatever, they could get up to, say, 15 units they could ask for. Under the new zoning, what might have changed that would now make it possible that that person may only be able to ask for 10 now, between the way the old zoning read and the way the current zoning would read? How would that, what might be affected? Do you
There isn't a
understand?
restriction in here on the number of units in a mixed-use building.
Different than the current bylaw?
There's no limit. It's really a function of how much built space do you have,
Well-
how many parking spaces, what are all the other requirements?
Yes and no, though, because if we're able to waive certain things, like the space between buildings on a parcel, it changes the amount of units that could fit on a parcel. But if that waiver goes away, then it changes how many might fit. I think that's really what you're ultimately going to end up with, is the question of what changes from current zoning, because you're going to have to take the whole thing. You're going to have to take any waivers that we can currently grant. If they go away, it's going to affect what can fit on a parcel.
Okay.
It's not an absolute
I
without
think
knowing
there's some
that.
confusion. What this bylaw is attempting to do is to say, if you do certain things, you can do that as of right, subject to site plan review. If you want relief from some things, if you want a waiver from some things, there are special permit options for the planning board in several sections of this bylaw. So it so happens that density isn't really a constraint in here, other than I have so much I can cover the lot with a building. So if I have, a 20,000 square foot lot, I can put a building on it of a certain footprint. I can go up a certain height. The first floor has to be commercial. So whatever I can do in those 2 stories above is residential. That's the number of units I could do, but I still have to provide parking for them. I still have to have an open space ratio. So there are these things that ultimately influence. This is really about, it's really more of a design approach to development than I think you're accustomed to. That said, if there's something that applicant can't meet and get to the by right, subject to site plan review, the provision exists in several places in here that one could ask the planning board for a special permit to relieve certain requirements. So it's a hybrid type of bylaw. Instead of everything requiring a special permit, some things may lead to the request for a special permit. So there's greater guarantee for the applicant.
I don't want to steal you. I'll come back after.
I'm not trying to dodge your question. I'm trying to give you an honest answer here and not give you something that's not really accurate.
So again, I think that comes back to the point then, which is that if we can't see what the change result is in the new bylaw from the old bylaw, that's a problem, because that's a question someone's going to have. I mean, that's one of the areas that I think people do have issues with.
Sure.
Is what can fit on a lot under the current zoning and under the new zoning. And that's going to be a question someone's going to want an answer to. And I think just saying, not having an apple-to-apple comparison to say, on this lot, as an example, under the current zoning, someone could ask for this much. Under the new zoning, they can ask for this much.
I think the
taking
answer,
all of it into account.
I think the most honest way to answer a question like that with this type of zoning is that the maximum someone could ask for is X. So under this zoning, you can ask for this. Under this type of zoning, the maximum you can ask for is X. That's really the way to answer it. I mean, part of what we've tried to do here is say, if your community really wants mixed-use development, then you need the tools to do mixed-use development, which you don't really have right now. You have zoning that tries to knit together the approaches to regulating multifamily development with the approaches to regulating commercial. So I don't really know that you have what you think you have. And what we've been trying to say here is, if you want mixed-use development, there are ways that this is done. It's a different type of zoning.
Point of order.
And I think we could easily explain this with some graphics.
Excuse me, point of order. I know that we just had Mr. Kuko come up here and say something, and I just want that to be read for all the people that heard the same thing. Since we have had him up here and speak, I just want him to make that comment out loud. It wasn't anything bad, but I do want, for transparency's sake, that comment to be spoken to, if you would not mind. He was just explaining, and I think that this goes to the point of confusion and transparency, and it's really important. Thank you.
I was pointing out to Mr. Johnson that currently in our overlay districts, we have no maximum building coverage or minimum open space. Now, under the districts, we have for major projects, all other projects, in the mixed-use business, limited business, west side, south business, and general business, we now have minimum open space requirements of certain percentage and maximum building coverage, which we never had before. We had those in the big industrial districts, we had them in the commercial districts, but we didn't have them in the overlay districts. So now, I'm going to call them the overlay districts, even though they're not overlay districts in the new bylaw, but each one of them has maximum building coverage.
So I think, don't leave. So that's sort of my point, though, is that that's what the new bylaw does. That's what's there now that didn't exist before. What I'm saying is, for your average person, if they want to know, how is the new bylaw maybe addressing a concern I used to have, which was on X parcel, they could have asked for 18. Because of that, they can now only ask for 12. That's what I'm saying, is that you can't get that, we can't get from A to B to answer a layperson's question, because that's the question we get when they come into our hearing, which is, why can he ask for 18? Well, because that's how it works. If they brought it in a month after this one passes, that person can ask for 12. And I'm just making up numbers. These aren't absolute, but I'm saying, if we can't answer that question, we're not addressing the concern that a citizen might have of why this bylaw is better than the old bylaw, or why that section is better than the old bylaw. Does that, and again, I apologize, because I feel like I stole some of Mr. Delaney's time, just to try and clarify that question, but I think that was your question.
Yeah, well, probably because we live and breathe this thing and we know it, and we might be a little callous on it, but I think Steve said at the beginning, and Judy reiterated it, that when we say development standards, which we really didn't have, these are the development standards. This is the thing that was added in. So, this is 2 pages. We can come up with something that says we added development standards that didn't exist before.
No mas.
One way, I guess I would just like to leave it at this, because I don't want to frustrate people, but one way to think about guiding development is a metric one. How many units can you get? Another way to think about guiding development is about design, and what it's going to look like, and how it's going to feel in your community, and how it's going to relate to the properties around it, and what it's going to give to your town in terms of its aesthetic contribution. This bylaw is about design. This is a qualitative approach more than a quantitative approach. And I know that for people who are not used to this, that feels weird, because they still want to know how much somebody can build. But I would encourage the planning board, as many other planning boards in Massachusetts have done, is to rethink how you guide development. That it's not just about metrics, it's about qualitative outcomes.
Were you done, Jay? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Sadwick. I have just a short statement. At the beginning of this evening, I was asked, what are you going to talk about? What are you going to do? It said, as a member of the committee, of the zoning committee, my being here is to listen to the questions, digest them, and find out the information that comes up, and try and satisfy the concerns via these new questions or information. That's what we're responsible for, because we don't know everything. So we would hope that we can digest this information from people in not just the front table, but people out here. That's what we're going to be listening for. Maybe not tonight, but in the next meeting. But thank you. That's my objective, and that's the way I'm going to stick with it. Thank you. Mr. Sadwick?
Oh, I'm going to turn it up. Jump in there, Bob. So, we've been listening to a lot of questions, a lot of conversation, and this is just from the planning board and the selectmen. When the residents get involved, there's going to be a million more questions. So, to the point, we need to do some work. We need to, as these questions come forward in front of us, we need to have some way of coming up with the, most frequently asked questions on these things, highlight these things, get these answers out there so everybody is comfortable. This is as transparent as possible. This is not to try to change something to harm someone. This is try to do something to better our town. And that's the whole point. I mean, people have been working for 3 years. I came into this thing late. but I'm glad I'm on the board, and so I can listen I listen to residents every day. I go to planning board meetings, I listen to their concerns. I understand where it's coming from, elected officials, residents, and what we're doing. And we're trying to get to that point, so it looks like we have a little bit more work to do. And, we're going to get this message out. We probably should get something up on our website to say, here's what the place, here's our latest version, here's the old version. Put something up there and let them know to be able to go through this. My concern always with this was getting people to read something in June, July, and August is not the easiest thing, and get people to come to public meetings is never an easy thing to get them to come. But they're going to come to town meeting, and it's going to be a free-for-all, as usual, when we get into those type of things. So we need to get the answers out there, and we got to be able to answer those and be prepared to answer the questions if we want this thing to pass and make a better bylaws for this community. With that, I'm just going to end it and just ask if there's any last questions from any of the board members. Jane, you got one more?
Really quickly, just really quickly, when you come to town meeting, I highly recommend, speaking as former moderator, that we have the ability to project all of the text up on the wall so that folks can follow along from their seats rather than from paper, so that's all. Thank you.
So noted.
There's only one working microphone.
No, we got to put those swinging back and forth.
I'm convinced everybody's tired of hearing from me, but I'm going to do it anyway, so that's fine. Mr. Kratman made a point just now. I am concerned, though, that most of the public meetings for this are going to be held in the summer. The only meeting that anyone's going to really end up at is September, and that's going to be after this thing's filed. I think that's concerning because from listening tonight, there is not really an apples to apples comparison that we can make here. And I'll say this, I'm not convinced the way we do it is wrong. You and I think, have disagreed on this anytime we've discussed
I
it.
didn't say you're wrong.
I'm not convinced the way we do it is wrong and that it needs a different version, a new version. I'm not convinced we need a different version as much as this, because this is not apples to apples. This is an apples to orange comparison. We can't answer some of the questions people have because it's a completely different approach to doing it. And like I said, I'm not convinced we were wrong to begin with. I think we've gone along for quite some time, able to make decisions here that I think have benefited the town. Everybody hasn't been happy with all of them. I fear that this version is not going to make people happy when they're done, as it stands now. I'll ask the committee for the planning board's purposes anyways, if you could possibly provide us with a breakdown of where the planning board had decision-making power and now does not in this version, as well as the amount of waivers options we've lost. I'll give you an example, just because it's easy. The message board sign has 9 pieces to it. In the current bylaw, any one of those 9 is waivable by the planning board during our hearing. We are now down to 3, one of which is the 10-second thing at the end, which I don't even understand why it's still there, because every time we've had a meeting, we've had conversations where that change time doesn't matter anymore. It's been checked, it's been studied. Whether the sign changes every minute, every whatever, is not really affecting drivers. But we can't even waive that now because it's been removed from our power. So now signs will have to change no less than 10 seconds because it just happens to be what's written there. And we have no control over it anymore. And I don't understand why we've been limited in those from 9 down to 3. I'm not even sure why we have the 3 that we have are the ones we have. Mr. Fowler made a point about signs. You're talking about the difference between Market Basket asking for a sign possibly and Joe's Pizza. It might be reasonable for Market Basket to ask for a larger sign than Joe's Pizza. But as it stands now, we can't make that decision to allow Market Basket something different. It's the size that it is, because we no longer have the ability to waive and amend the size of a sign if asked, the way it reads now. So it's an example of what I'm talking about. It's like we used to be able to deal with that. Now we won't be able to. So
I hear what you're saying, and before the waivers went into the zoning bylaw, which occurred over the last 15 years, people would have to seek a variance. And it was just built into their timeline of understanding if they were going to ask for something above.
And again, I'm really dealing in reality. Our 5 members are elected and show up pretty much all the time. the zoning board of appeals has a rotating board constantly because it's appointed. And sometimes they don't even have quorum there. All I'm saying is, I don't know why that makes sense. I said this way back when we started this. I don't know why things are being shifted to the Board of Appeals, away from the planning board. But I don't understand what the problem was. Why is it shifting over to there
Steve,
when
there's
we
not,
had it?
the special permit authority has not shifted to the Board of Appeals.
It's not.
No, but you just said, the things that we were able to waive that are falling out now, you'd have to go seek a waiver for. You'd have to go see the other board to do things we used to be able to do, but for what reason? Why is it being shifted over there? We have every 2 weeks, pretty much with 5 members every single time. So whatever decision needs to be made can be made. I don't know that the Board of Appeals has that happen all the time. It's nothing against the Board of Appeals. It's different. They're not elected, they're appointed. It keeps rotating. The people are falling on and off that board. Sometimes they don't have quorum. How are they going to make that decision for somebody when they want it? They now have to go to a completely different board, hope that everybody's going to be there to get the variance they're asking for when there was no problem with it having done where it was. Nine things we could have dealt with, down to 3 for why. And where else in the bylaw is that changing to? It's all over the place. That's my point.
Yeah, no.
I don't know. I haven't been convinced why it's being shifted, I guess is my point.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Sadler?
You need the mic.
Oh, sorry.
I'd like to have Mr. Sadwick answer that if he'd like to. He seemed to have some points.
What, on why it was being shifted? We talked about waivers a lot in the committee.
Right.
And one of the things that came up was that there was no criteria for the waivers. If you're going for a special permit, there's criteria in the bylaws as to what you're basing your decision on. If you're going for a variance, there are criteria that's in the bylaw and in the general laws that tell you how to grant a variance. For the waiver provisions that were in the existing bylaw, there was no criteria as to how those waivers were going to be granted. And those waivers were being granted within a special permit, which was, and Steve, you referenced this, which was a 4/5 vote, but I think those waivers were being granted on a simple majority of a 3/5 vote.
Right, and I said, I have no
Yeah,
problem if you want to change
it's-
the other, but the sign one is an example. You give a criteria, but then you remove 6 abilities of things to change. What I'm saying is that's going through other sections of the bylaw. There are other places where this would have been something that would have been dealt with in one place, and now we're making it have to be dealt with in 2 places, and I don't understand why that makes sense. I understand that we're making some of these changes because other towns do it, and other towns have done it. I'm not still convinced why we are wrong with the way we do it, and that's my point. I don't know why it's a problem. If you tell me it's a problem because of X, fine. I'm not hearing that. I'm just simply hearing something's changed. Well, yeah, I know, but you're just saying that. But for that example, there is criteria written in there for what you're using to make that decision.
I will tell you, especially on the signs, where there was the sign waivers that were put in there, again, don't have the third consultant here, Bob Ritchie, but when it came to waivers, he was very adamant about them not being, and again, this is somebody who was the former Assistant Attorney General who reviewed hundreds of bylaws and who is still engaged when it comes to municipal law practice, and just did not feel that it was appropriate in the sign section of the bylaw. I mean, and I can have them.
I'll agree to
but-
disagree because I don't know why what we're doing
Right,
doesn't
and
work.
I hear what you're saying, and but I took as many notes as I think you did, so there's a lot of questions that I'll be following up with answers.
So if it got lost in the thing, again, I ask that if you can
Yeah.
provide where we've lost the decision-making and where we've lost the ability to issue waivers, it would help, at least at my board, I think,
Yep.
understand where we live in this from now on, if this stays as it is.
Yep.
So,
I was going to say, in closing, unless there's any more questions or comments from the boards, I think what I just wanted to do was kind of go back to The 20th being a public session that will be held at the Senior Center, the 25th, public session that will be held here at Town Hall. There will be some cable presentations over the course of the summer. There will be at least one public session again in September, in addition to the planning board's public hearing, which is required for zoning changes. And there was a lot of good input and comments from both boards as far as concerns and as far as things that we can do to help explain the bylaw, the proposed bylaw in a better fashion. So I thank everybody for their time this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would adjourn, yeah.
Yeah. All right, I'll listen to a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second?
Stephen, thank you.
All those in favor?
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second. Motion made, second, all those in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye. All in favor, motion unanimous. Thank you.